You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. Welcome back to Storytime in Paris. This week's guest is best-selling author Robert Dinsdale. Rob's latest novel, Paris by Starlight, is a beautiful work of magical realism that has been likened to the work of Neil Gaiman and Erin Morgenstern. In it, the Paris we know and love, with its citizens living by day, transforms with the arrival of the people who have been exiled from their homeland, who live by night. It's one of the most original books I've read in a long time, and I just fell into the world he created. The descriptions of the flora and the fauna that magically begin to cover the city made me want to crawl inside the book and live in its world. I'm thrilled to have a chance to speak with him now, so without further ado, please allow me to introduce Robert Dinsdale, author of Paris by Starlight. Hello, Robert. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Gosh, it's not a very, very fascinating story, really. My name is Rob. I live in a place called Leigh-on-Sea, which is on the Thames Estuary just outside London. Although I'm not a native of here. I come from further north near Old York in Yorkshire in England. And yeah, I write books. Paris by Starlight is my most recent novel. The one before that was a book called The Toymakers, and a book called Gingerbread sometime before that. And then some books 10 years ago too. And yeah, I guess that's my day in, day out.
Perfect. So you mentioned Paris by Starlight, and that's what we're going to be talking mainly about today. Can you tell us a little bit about the plot of this book?
So Paris by Starlight. I had written a book called The Toymakers, which is a kind of magical realist fantasy novel set in the early 20th century about a toy shop in London. And along the way with that, I started thinking about how, I guess, magic and fantasy work in books and what books last longest in the memory. And I realized everything I'd been writing until then had been set historically, partly because when I'm reading a book, I like to go somewhere else in time or space, and very little interest in reading about the world that I live in. And of course, some readers and writers love that, but it's something that ever drew me to it. But I started thinking that the books that lasted longest in the imagination were books that were about the here and now. So you'd get those writers like, the classics. Dickens was writing about what was right in front of him. And I started thinking about ways that you could use magic and fantasy to talk about the world that we have today. And Paris by Starlight is the sort of product of that. And it's a book about people who come from a country that's been ransacked, invaded by the Russians in Central Asia, and they go on a migrant quest to Europe, as we see in the world happening a lot today. And it's about those people who land in Paris. And then they come from a place where traditionally their ancestors lived by night. And in an attempt to keep connection to the homeland, which has now been sort of wiped off the map, they decide too that they're going to live nocturnally in Paris. And as they do that, they sort of reawaken the myth and the magic that once that was their world in a time gone by. And the book then, it follows a young man from these people and his, I guess, romance with a young French girl who's come to Paris looking for the father who abandoned her when she was young. And it's their stories, they intertwine, but it's the story of the rise and fall of a nocturnal world in Paris and the tensions that can come from both sides of people who are trying to integrate. If that makes sense.
It does. Can you tell us, what is your connection to Paris or to France?
I guess the decision to do it in Paris, it comes from a couple of different angles. First off, it's just a love for Paris. I am British, but Paris is is the first stop of the continent for us, I suppose. So Paris is a place that I visited various times over my life, and had good times and bad there. So I just feel like it's a city that I am still drawn to in some way, beyond the cities that I've lived in here. But also, it's just a city that is just ripe for this story and this setting, because it's a city that has its migrant question, like lots of cities do, but one that feels it was keenly debated and felt in Paris. It's a city with sort of history of occupation and a history of besieging and a history of like those wrestles of ownership of who owns Paris. It's a city of revolution as well, and it's a city where people are not traditionally afraid to make their views and thoughts known, whether that's Yellow Jackets with Macron or much further back in history too. So for all sorts of reasons, Paris worked for the story that I wanted to tell. And it was just a really good excuse to spend some time, mentally in Paris for a year.
Have you spent much time here in person?
I have to say I've not been for a few years. I have a young daughter, and Paris is not her thing yet. One day it might be. But yeah, over the years, Paris was always the stop that you'd go to with partners or just solo. I did a couple of weeks in Paris when I was about 22, and that was the first time I'd been. I had a friend who went busking in Paris, and he was doing that, and I was kicking around. So I guess my relationship, if you like, with Paris begins there. It's just a place to come back to. One of those places that you have that sometimes you visit somewhere once and that's enough, but once is not enough with Paris. So yeah,
I agree with that. Before we get too much into the questions about this book, I want to start by talking about the magic that you've created and this world of Paris at night, Paris by Starlight, because it's such a beautiful world that you create. It's just, it's visceral and immersive and stunning the way that you describe it. So can you talk a little bit about how Paris transforms for our listeners so they know what the world looks like at night?
So this is a sort of, writing a book, I guess, is a bit patchwork. And it comes from an idea I had for a book and that I never set about writing a while ago, about a family who suddenly have to be thrown back together in their old family home, but there's too many of them now, so they decide half of us are going to live by day and half of us are going to live by night. We're going to occupy this same space together, and the tensions that would arise in that sort of crumbling old English mansion as I imagined it. Now, I never got around to writing that book, but somewhere along the way it morphed into what Paris by Starlight is, because in Paris by Starlight, the people from the old country come to Paris, and one of them starts living by night to honour his dying grandmother. And suddenly there's some romantic appeal in this for them. And as they do, the old world kind of wakes up. And it's a world of, strange flora and fauna that existed in a time gone by. That's now been sort of decimated from the map, but has remained in people's memories and hearts, and is suddenly resurgent in the night. So these people, the people from the old country, end up living in these, I guess if we wanted to be slightly pretentious about it, there'd be those liminal spaces. So they're on the rooftops, they're in the disused yards and the railway sidings of Paris, which tends to be where a lot of migrant people looking for a home wind up. And if you look at the underpasses and some of the railway sidings, especially in northern Paris that I saw, there were the tent cities sort of emerged there. And I guess my novel imagines the tent cities as a separate world laid over the map of Paris that we would know. And yeah, it's a place where, the flowers reflect the starlight and things are luminous and iridescent. And by night, there isn't just night. There's sort of beauty crystallized in rooftop gardens and markets that spring up and move around the riverbanks and the sidings and the wastelands of Paris. So those in-between places become the sort of beautiful places, and ownership is staked of them by these people who live by night.
And at first, at least, there's this acceptance from the Parisians that it seems like this kind of magic really could or should exist here. And even the gendarmes in the night markets are like awed by everything. What do you think it is about Paris that allows for us to believe that this kind of magic could exist here?
Well, it's the city of light, isn't it? people talk about it like that. And, cities have characters, don't they? Or you call them reputations, I suppose. So whether it's, London and our obsession with historical blitz spirit and how we got through the war, even though none of us were actually there, or the sort of guttery, glamorous grime of Berlin, I would say, is another feeling. And New York certainly has its own character. There were people, you think of New York and you think these certain things. And when we think of Paris, it is sort of like the light and beauty and the romance of the city. And those things become self-fulfilling, don't they? Because when you think of a place like something, then it becomes like that. And I guess that's part of the book as well. When you think of something, it's going to manifest. And I don't know, there's something about Paris that the glowing nocturnal world just seem to tessellate nicely with what with what your instincts are about the city, whether you've been there or not, actually, because, Paris is light and love.
Yeah. I think that's true. There's a quote, I'm going to read you to yourself. There's a quote that you have in the book.
I'll enjoy that.
There's a quote in here that I really love. And it's only Paris because everyone who comes here thinks it's Paris. It's only Paris because it makes you dream of learning and lights and walking with someone you love in the rain. Paris doesn't exist, Levin. It's all up here.
It's true of everything and everybody, actually, isn't it? Because, by any... An alien visitor to the world would just look at things that's stone and there's metal and it's corrugated iron and a river and lots of pollution and smog and stuff. And from one level, that's London too, and it's Berlin and it's Lisbon and it's New York and it's Chicago and it's wherever. But what sets it apart is what you think about it, and whether that's a city or it's or a person, or it's just, or any place, or it's just about anything. Really, it's what you think about something that dictates what it is, I think. Yeah, so I just think that's Paris is a feeling, I suppose. I mean, it's also this certain square mileage on the banks of the River Seine, but that makes it a city. It doesn't make it Paris.
I think there's this idea that collectively everyone has decided that Paris is a place of romance and love and possibility. And so we all feed into that, and that's its own sort of magic.
Well, exactly, it is. And when you enter those sort of collective delusions, if you like, then they become real. And that's what's happening in Paris by Starlight, because I guess the people from the old country enter into this collective belief that the old world is going to be resurgent around them. And suddenly it's waking up. And, there are birds that didn't exist for the last 200 years on the Central Asian steppes suddenly fluttering around the skyscrapers in, uptown Paris. So I guess that is one of the themes of the book, that, you dream stuff into being.
Mm-hmm. One of the sources of this magic seems to be the Nocturne, which is like a book of the people's folklore, and maybe it could be likened to the Bible for Christianity, something like that, where these stories sort of, and the magic sort of originates, maybe?
I think more it's that they're crystallized in it. So those things exist. It's just that, it's a story, and things need to be anchored in something, I suppose. And a book of folklore from your old world, I guess, is just a place where, or an item where all those old superstitions and stories and beliefs, and just where culture is crystallized, because culture gets crystallized in stories, and it's something that people cling on to, right? So there's a reason people burn books if you don't believe in them, because they become totems of the idea or the knowledge that's inside them. And of course, you can't kill the knowledge by burning the book, but there is something totemic about the book too. So in Paris by Starlight, I don't think it's that the book has a sort of Disney-fied magical power from which magic will pour. It's just that it is a gateway to believing something or to investing in something. Because if they've got their old stories from the old world, then they have, one hand on the world that's been taken from them, and they've got something to invest in and believe. So the proliferation of those stories in the book becomes, I guess, a vessel by which sort of like belief and investment and love for the past and all those sorts of things gets passed around.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
We get to read some passages from it that you've written. So I'm curious to know, how many of these stories have you fleshed out and how many maybe have you written?
Oh, zero.
Okay.
Absolutely zero. And I tell you why, because I don't want to. I think I really enjoyed writing those passages, but they're probably the most difficult to write. And I guess, well, it's not the difficulty that puts you off writing them. It's the fact that there is more magic and majesty in the window into something than there is, in it, if you like. And I think that's true of just about all experiences in life. But the one thing that really irritates me in sort of, I guess, modern storytelling, especially Hollywood storytelling, is we've got to plug all the gaps. Whether it's a massive franchise that gets pumped out on Disney or Star Wars or something, we've got to plug all those gaps. And actually, there's much more wonder in just hinting at something and letting the viewer or the imagination take them down this rabbit hole than if I painted it all for somebody to see. So I guess I like the feeling that people might want to know more about that world, but you've got your window into it, and I think that's more precious than having the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And also, since it's a sacred document for the people, and we're not of this people, then maybe there's a reason why we don't get to read the full thing.
Maybe, and it should just be a bit of mystery about it,
Yeah.
And people like mystery. I like mystery. You just want the hint of something beautiful but unknown over the horizon. Keeps you going. But often you get to the horizon, well, it's just another dump, isn't it? And it's better to, there's just something, and that's in the book as well, that sense of looking back and wistfulness, that golden age stuff that plagues all society and all civilization. It is always true that golden age didn't really exist. It's just, and mostly what happens is, like, people of my generation thinking, God, everything was easier in the 80s, wasn't it? Everything was easier in the 80s and the early 90s. It wasn't. It was easier for you because you were 8. And you didn't have to think about money and global politics and where the roof was coming from, or relationships and breakdown of relationships. You didn't have to think about any of that stuff because you were a kid. And I think that's where a lot of golden age nostalgia comes from. But it's true that when you can, the hint of a golden age is really inspiring, but the reality of it isn't. So I guess in the book, I don't think I'm even saying there was a golden age of nocturnally living at night. In fact, the whole book is a deconstruction of that once you get beauty, it's probably going to be corrupted at some point, and you just better hold on to the bits of it that you can, because, you can't change the passage of time and the movement of the ages, whether that's in your personal life or whether it's in the world. So yeah, part of me would like to write a few more snippets of that world, but I've no real desire to write the whole bedrock of it.
Okay. When you look beyond the magic in this book, it's really the story of the people who have been forced from their homes. And now they're refugees and they're seeking asylum. And during this 3,000-mile journey, many of them die. Many of them are imprisoned or sent to detention centers or met with violence and starvation. Why did you decide to tell this story of refugees through the lens of magical realism?
Well, I think I said before that a sense of that to write something that mattered and resonated to people, you were looking at the world in front of you. And so I definitely want to do that. I think there is something in magic and myth, which for me lets you hold a mirror up at what's actually happening instead of writing that gritty, grounded realism, which is I think that both things are just different ways of telling, of reaching the same feeling of something. I did wrestle with whether I should be writing a refugee story because, of course, there was a huge amount of debate about who owns what stories now. Yeah. And I don't really find myself perhaps on the prevailing opinion of it, in that I think we should be writing. We shouldn't be shutting ourselves down to writing about other people, because then eventually fiction would just become memoirism, and then all those bridges that you can build or try and understand other people's worlds in writing would just be burnt down. But I did wrestle with whether I should be doing that, writing a refugee story, and ultimately I think I decided that, well, look, I'm a member of the world, and there's a Syrian family live a few doors down from me. There's quite a lot of Ukrainians in my neighborhood now and stuff. So the refugee crises that happen in the world, and which are going to increasingly happen across our lifetimes, it's about us all. And of course, I've not gone on a migrant journey. I'm lucky enough to have been born in a country where that's never, touch wood, is never going to be a thing that happens. But these are the pressing concerns of the day, and they're right in front of you. And of course, the book is not, because I'm not entirely, I'm depicting a fictional people, and through a different lens. I hope that the stories of it are true to the stories I would read about and talk about. But I'm not trying to capture any specific experience in that either. I mean, it is a pure accident that, a year or so after writing this novel, Russia did decide to invade, in the Ukraine and kick off another migrant crisis. So, yeah.
There's a common refrain in the book, which you sort of alluded to before, this saying that's repeated over and over, which is, if you don't look after something that belongs to you, someone else just comes along and takes it. And this belief that so many of the characters have, juxtaposed with this belief that magic is for everyone, seems to start a lot of the conflict in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and again, that's a belief in the book. It's not necessarily my belief, although some days it is. There's a tension in the book, and I think there's a tension in real life about how far you go to protect what's yours, and how, protectionism can turn to a really negative force in your life. So that if you're looking for an enemy, you're going to find one, and things become self-fulfilling. So I think how do I say this? So in the book, there is this family arrive in Paris, and sometime after that, another member of their family arrives, and he's seen a lot of bad things along his way. And when he gets to Paris and he sees what's been accomplished in Paris, the resurgence of his old world, he would do anything not to let that vanish. But in trying not to let it vanish, his actions in doing that will eventually lead to this destruction of this beautiful world. And I think, it's a slightly cynical viewpoint that good things flourish, but once good things flourish, often bitternesses and envies and jealousies can set in. And I'm not just talking about in sort of the migrant refugee world, I'm talking about in all of our worlds. And then they become undermined. So sometimes I feel like there's a natural passage of, things growing, being beautiful, and then tanking. But we make them tank a lot of the time. And there are forces on both sides sort of pulling in the book to make this happen. And I guess if the book's a pain to anything, it's sort of a plea to sort of middle ground sense and sensibility. And the people who really survive it are the people who, they don't want the world. They just want their little happiness.
Yeah, exactly. A blending, not just of night and day and black and white and, people versus Parisians, but a blending of everything, our own little piece of it.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think, because what happens in the book is, as soon as walls start going up, and I don't mean physical walls, but as soon as walls start going up, then it generates war and things escalate. And it's very, very easy to see how wars, private or global, escalate from, the tiniest little things. And it tends to be when people start getting really protective. So,
yeah. So the book begins with Esme, who is a young girl, and her father, Emmanuel, who is the head park keeper at the Jardin des Tuileries. And then they come back for a couple of interludes, but they're not integrally woven into the story. Can you talk about why you decided to include them?
Well, the simple answer is that they were meant to be a lot more in an early versions. And I was going to, in my original vision of the book, the story of the rise and fall of Paris by Starlight was punctured by various different perspectives from across the city. So, because it was really important to me in this book to show, because the breadth of experience and the breadth of stories that happen just in a city. And Paris is great for that. If those big Paris novels like, Les Mis and things, you see high and low and every angle, street level and, and the corridors of power kind of level. And I was going to do that littered around the city. So they were going to be one of many voices. But actually, once I had it's a bit difficult to say this for people who haven't read the book, but the book is punctuated by the father figure from the old country as he crosses Europe and gets through various checkpoints, and he has to make various dangerous border crossings until he can reach his family in Paris. But by the time I had that story progressing in its interludes, then if I then also had all these different perspectives, various of which I'd written, sort of punctuating it too, it was a mess. And I think especially in sort of modern publishing and modern storytelling, you don't really want a mess. And there was an age where people wrote sort of messy books and they were brilliant and it didn't really matter. But I think things are a bit more streamlined and commodified now. And Paris by Starlight is already quite a chunky book because I'm overly verbose and I can't rein myself in very much. So a lot of it got stripped away, but I didn't want to strip away these two because it's effectively just an analogous portrait of me and my daughter because we live together here. And yeah, I don't know. I like that. And it's another little vignette that shows how something that is beautiful turns to a bit of fear as well, because at the beginning, in the prologue of the book, the girl opens up the windows and she's peering off at Paris by Starlight, which is this beautiful world. But as the book progresses, you can see that, once the magic starts becoming omnipresent in Paris and people have started, turning against it a little bit, the father figure in his protection of his daughter gets a little bit scared and won't let her anymore. So that's just a tiny little vignette to reflect what's going on in the bigger story of Paris by Starlight, which hopefully reflects what's going on in Isabel and Levon's story in terms of their little family that they're building too. So yeah, just a small little vignette. I almost took it out, but I didn't have anything as strong to open it with, I think, so I kept it.
Oh, I'm glad you didn't. Oh, I also, it's not lost on me that this is a really lovely relationship between a daughter and her father, and our two central characters were both grew up with absentee fathers. So there's an interesting juxtaposition there as well.
Yeah, and I hope that what comes across in the book is that, what I'm talking about, the rise and fall of a beautiful world and the destruction of it is happening on a personal level as well as a world level. And without giving too many spoilers, they end in different ways.
Yes, and the story is really grounded in as much as it's about all of these bigger topics and this magic everywhere, it really is anchored by the specific individual love of people and their families, or their chosen families, or the families they're born into.
And it is chosen family as well, isn't it? Because, of course, they rocked up in Paris and families are sundered and deaths have happened and people got to pick up and do what they can. And yeah, and I come from a very, very boring, unsundered family myself, but I have, in my adult life, a bit of a hodgepodge family. So that's always been very interesting to me.
Are you searching for spiritual guidance? The Heart of You podcast is an exploration into your soul through intuition, spirituality, divination, and unconditional love. Host Annette DeLu is a spiritual guidance coach, intuitive, Akashic, and tarot reader who discusses practical ways to integrate spiritual growth into your everyday life. Listen now to The Heart of You on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
So I think it would be a nice thing now to maybe hear a little bit from the book.
Okay, I can do that. So this passage comes from the beginning of volume 2 of the book, when Levon and his family have arrived in Paris. They've already met Isabel, who is to become Levon's lover, and the grandmother of the family, who brings the book of old folk tales from the old country, the Nocturne, with her, has in the previous chapter sadly passed away. And in holding her funeral on one of the rooftop gardens in Paris, they decide that they're all going to live by night to commit themselves to her memory. And suddenly, the magic of Paris by night is surging up around them. Book 2, Paris, the City of Lights. In the time of enchantment, before you were born, a young man named Tamaz made landfall at dawn and said to his fellows who crowded the shore, "This night's a fantasia, but don't you want more? More than just sailing our ocean each night? More than just basking in silver starlight? The world's so much vaster than our stories say. I'll set off next nightfall for lands far away. One piece of wisdom," his captain then breathed, "before you set off on adventures like these. Through all of your dark times, one truth you must know. All that you love still exists long ago." Chapter 5, The Music of the Night. The rumour first reached the tenements in Kreuzberg, Berlin. Some young fool had started living by night. A moronic endeavour, somebody said. It's been hundreds of years since the old-timers last lived by night. This is the modern age. Now there's economics. There's science. What good could be done by looking back at things that ceased to exist all those eons ago, if indeed they ever existed at all? Live by night, somebody scoffed. The very idea. And yet, we did it once, somebody said. I remember how my great-grandfather would speak of that midnight world. The banks of the lakes would wake up at nightfall, and the flowers by night were like fields of starlight itself. The birds glowed with the nectar they drank. The lakes came alive with endless schools of the Backtat, glimmering just below the surface. My Bebier used to say that her Bebier had one of the last surviving water dogs from the days before the sea was poisoned. And I remember the old stories too. My grandfather knew the best tales. What might it be like to catch a glimpse of that world again? It's only one boy living at night, they said. It doesn't mean a thing. But it did. It meant a thing to the old-timers who'd found their way to Copenhagen. It meant a thing to the refugees still sitting in the camps outside Ankara, the detention centre at Budapest. It meant everything to the families scrabbling their pennies together in Munich and Berlin, anxiously waiting to discover if they might be being moved on. The very idea that somebody remembered, the idea that anybody cared. They say there are flowers by night growing in the gutters of Paris. They say that should you look up when you walk the Champs-Élysées by night, you can see luminescent dots darting in and out of every roof terrace, and that these are the light jars of old, brought back to life by the power of belief. The old country wasn't destroyed after all. It was broken into a billion tiny pieces, and each one of those pieces buried in one of us. It's the job of a people, they said, to restore what was broken. It can't all be left to one boy. His name is Levon, somebody said. It's a good solid name, a name from the old world. And yet, it's going to take us all if we're to be a people again. One boy cannot do it alone. So come, they said in Copenhagen. Come soon, they said in Kreuzberg, Berlin. Stop plotting your ways across the English Channel. Stop clinging to the landing gear of their aeroplanes and freezing to death 30,000 feet high. There's a new home now. It's where we belong. Come one, come all, they said, to Paris by Starlight.
I love it. That's one of my favorite passages. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I will say my only disappointment isn't the right word, but when I'm reading your book, sitting on the metro, and I read about this beautiful, glorious land, and then I leave the metro and I go outside, I'm like, oh, Paris is so boring.
Paris isn't boring. That's because you live there. There's
no color. Yeah, but you describe it so beautifully. And I'm like, oh, it's so beige. So what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
I do. I've got a new book coming out next September, a book called Once a Monster, and it is a book set in Victorian London this time, about, I'm not sure how to describe it really. So it's about a young mudlark. She's 10 years old and she lives on the banks of the River Thames, and they go ferreting in the dirt with her taskmaster every day for treasures that wash up on the shore. When a man with a body is found in the shore of a man with various deformities and the tattoo of a labyrinth on his back. And I'll leave it there. It's their relationship and who this man is. And yeah, it has a Greek mythy kind of thing going on.
Okay. All right. I'm going to add that to my reading list.
Thank you very much.
So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what's going on?
In my hovel somewhere. I'm not the best user of the internet as a place to connect and meet, but I'm on Twitter. So yeah, at Robert_Dinsdale maybe. Yeah, I'm an infrequent tweeter, but I'm always up there. So if people want to message me on there, that's probably the best place to get me.
Okay, perfect. And I'll include a link to that so people can find you easily.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rob. This was wonderful. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Robert Dinsdale for such a fascinating conversation. You can find Rob on Twitter at Robert_Dinsdale. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with author Barbara Davis about her book, The Keeper of Happy Endings. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Join our book club. The Storytime Book Club welcomes authors who have been featured on this podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. Our next guest will be season premiere guest Kate Reardon, discussing her book, The Heat Wave. For more information, including sign-up, please join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.